A millionaire forces his daughter to marry the gardener, but the gardener has a secret. The scent of freshly cut roses filled the morning air as James Mitchell carefully trimmed the hedges of the Reynolds estate. His weathered hands moved with precision, each cut deliberate and measured. At 32, he'd spent the last 5 years tending to these gardens, making them his sanctuary. But today was different. Today, he could feel Elizabeth Reynolds' eyes following his every move from her bedroom window on the 3rd floor. Elizabeth, the only daughter of business tycoon Richard Reynolds, stood behind the curtain, watching the gardener with a mixture of contempt and resignation. At 28, she was being forced into what she considered the ultimate humiliation: marriage to the family's gardener. Her father's ultimatum still rang in her ears from their heated argument the previous evening. "You've rejected every suitable match I've presented," Richard had thundered, his face red with anger. "You want to play games? Fine, you'll marry the gardener within the month or you'll lose everything, your trust fund, your position in the company, everything." Elizabeth had laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. But Richard Reynolds didn't joke about such matters. The man who had built Reynolds Industries from the ground up was dead serious. "You can't be serious, father," Elizabeth had protested, her voice trembling. He's the gardener." "Exactly," Richard had replied with a cold smile. "Maybe this will finally teach you that life isn't about getting everything you want. You need to learn humility, Elizabeth, and James Mitchell will be your teacher." Now, standing at her window, Elizabeth watched as James methodically shaped the garden that had become his masterpiece over the years. She had to admit, there was something compelling about his quiet confidence, the way he moved with purpose and precision. But he was still just the gardener, wasn't he? What Elizabeth didn't know was that James Mitchell had his own reasons for accepting Richard's bizarre proposition. Behind his calloused hands and humble demeanor lay a secret that could shake the very foundation of the Reynolds empire. For 5 years, James had worked meticulously, not just tending to the gardens, but gathering information. Every conversation overheard during garden parties, every document glimpsed through windows, every whispered exchange between Richard and his business associates, all carefully filed away in his mind. He had watched the Reynolds family dynamics unfold like the petals of the roses he so carefully cultivated. He had seen Elizabeth grow from a spoiled heiress into a competent businesswoman, though she still carried that air of entitlement that came with wealth. He had observed Richard's increasingly desperate attempts to control his daughter's life, even as his own grip on the company began to slip. The marriage ultimatum wasn't a surprise to James. He'd been waiting for an opportunity like this, though he hadn't expected it to come in quite this form. When Richard had called him into his study the previous evening, James had maintained his usual quiet demeanor as the businessman laid out his unusual proposal. "I'm offering you a deal, Mitchell," Richard had said, swirling the bourbon in his crystal glass. "Marry my daughter, show her what it means to live without privilege, teach her humility. Do this, and I'll make it worth your while." James had simply nodded, his face betraying nothing of the thoughts racing through his mind. "Yes, sir, if that's what you think is best." What Richard didn't know was that James Mitchell wasn't just any gardener. His simple clothes and quiet manner masked years of education at top institutions, a brilliant mind that had once operated in the highest circles of finance. But that was before everything had changed, before he had discovered the truth that had set him on this path. Now, as he trimmed the roses with practiced ease, James could feel the weight of Elizabeth's gaze from above. He knew she was watching, knew she was probably seething with anger and humiliation. He allowed himself a small smile, hidden from view. The marriage would take place in less than a month. Elizabeth didn't know it yet, but she wasn't the only one being forced into this arrangement. She wasn't the only one with something to lose, or something to gain. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the immaculate lawn, James continued his work. Each snip of his shears was purposeful, each movement calculated, just like every step that had led him to this moment. The gardens of the Reynolds estate had become his canvas, but they were also his cover. Behind the facade of the humble gardener lay a man with a mission, a secret that had driven him to spend 5 years of his life orchestrating this very moment. Elizabeth finally turned away from the window, unable to watch any longer. She had no idea that the man she considered beneath her was about to become the catalyst for changes that would reshape both their lives forever. The simple gardener with dirt under his fingernails held secrets that could either destroy her family or save it, and even he wasn't sure which outcome he truly wanted anymore. Elizabeth sat in her father's study, her fingers drumming against the mahogany desk as the family lawyer droned on about the marriage contract. James stood quietly in the corner, still in his work clothes, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. His calm demeanor only fueled her growing anger. "This is ridiculous," she interrupted, standing abruptly. "I have an MBA from Wharton. I've closed million-dollar deals, and now you're all acting like I'm some child who needs to be taught a lesson." Richard Reynolds looked at his daughter with cold determination. "Sign the contract, Elizabeth. Unless you'd prefer to start looking for an entry-level position somewhere else, I'm sure your degree will land you something eventually." James watched the exchange silently, noting how Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. He'd seen that same tremor in her father's hands lately, a detail few would notice, but James had made an art of observation. "Fine," Elizabeth snapped, scrawling her signature across the bottom of the contract. "But I hope you're all happy with yourselves." She turned to James, her eyes blazing. "Especially you. Did you think you'd hit the jackpot? Marry the boss's daughter and never have to work again?" James stepped forward, and for the first time, Elizabeth noticed something different in his bearing. He moved with a grace that seemed at odds with his supposed background, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her step back. "Ms. Reynolds," he said quietly, "I assure you I have no interest in your family's money. This arrangement serves a purpose, nothing more." His words sent a chill down her spine. There was something in his tone, something that hinted at deeper currents beneath his peaceful exterior. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of forced interactions and awkward meetings with the wedding planner. Elizabeth insisted on keeping the ceremony small, refusing to turn her humiliation into a society spectacle. James agreed to everything with that same unnerving calm. One evening, Elizabeth found herself wandering the gardens, seeking escape from another tense dinner with her father. She found James there, tending to the night-blooming jasmine. He worked without gloves now, and she noticed a thin scar running across his palm. Not the kind of scar a gardener would typically have. "Who are you, really?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the directness of the question. James straightened slowly, studying her in the fading light. "Someone who knows what it's like to lose everything," he answered after a long moment. "Just like you're afraid of doing now." "You don't know anything about me," Elizabeth retorted, but her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "I know you've been quietly buying up shares in your father's company through shell corporations," James said softly. "I know you're trying to protect yourself from exactly this type of situation. I know you're smarter than your father gives you credit for." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. She had been so careful, using every trick she'd learned in business school, and then some. No one was supposed to know about those investments. "How?" she began, but James was already turning back to his work. "We all have our secrets, Miss Reynolds. Some of us are just better at keeping them." That night, Elizabeth barely slept. She spent hours researching James Mitchell but found nothing beyond the basic background check her father had run when hiring him. It was as if he hadn't existed before coming to work at the estate. What she didn't know was that James was in his small cottage on the estate grounds, making a phone call that would set the next phase of his plan in motion. "It's time," he spoke quietly into the phone. "She's starting to ask the right questions. Make sure everything is in place for after the wedding." The voice on the other end was female, professional. "Are you sure about this, James? Once we start, there's no going back. Reynolds will know exactly who you are." "That's the point," James replied, his fingers tracing the scar on his palm. "He destroyed my family's company, drove my father to suicide, and buried it all so deep that no one ever questioned it. It's time Richard Reynolds learned that some debts don't go away just because you ignore them." As he ended the call, James walked to his window, looking up at the main house where he could see Elizabeth's light still on. She was probably still trying to figure him out, and he felt a twinge of something unexpected. Regret, perhaps. She wasn't her father, after all, but she was the key to everything. The wedding was a week away, and soon Elizabeth would learn that her forced marriage to the gardener was just the beginning. The real storm was yet to come, and when it broke, it would wash away the carefully maintained facades of both the Reynolds and Mitchell families, revealing truths that had been buried for over a decade. James returned to his desk, opening a hidden compartment beneath the drawer. Inside lay a single photograph. A much younger Richard Reynolds shaking hands with James's father outside Mitchell Financial's headquarters. Both men were smiling. It was taken the day before Reynolds began his hostile takeover, the day before everything changed. Tomorrow, James would continue playing the humble gardener, continue watching Elizabeth struggle with their approaching wedding. But soon, very soon, the masks would come off. And then everyone would learn that while Richard Reynolds had spent years building his empire, James Mitchell had spent years planning its fall. What he hadn't planned for was the way Elizabeth's presence was beginning to complicate everything. The way she made him question motives he'd thought were set in stone. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold. Elizabeth stood before her mirror, wearing a simple white dress that cost a fraction of what she'd once imagined her wedding gown would be. Her mother's pearl necklace felt heavy against her collarbone, the only piece of family jewelry she'd chosen to wear for this farce of a ceremony. In his cottage, James methodically buttoned a shirt that cost more than a gardener's monthly salary. The expensive fabric felt familiar against his skin, a reminder of the life he'd left behind. Today would change everything, but not in the way Richard Reynolds expected. The ceremony was small, held in the estate's garden that James had so carefully maintained. Only a handful of witnesses attended. Richard Reynolds, his lawyer, and a few key business associates who'd been quietly instructed to keep the whole affair private. Elizabeth noticed that none of her real friends had been invited, and James had no family present. The hollow echo of their I-do's seemed to mock the beautiful setting. As they exchanged rings, Elizabeth's hands were ice cold, James's were steady and warm, and something in the way he held her fingers made her look up at his face. For a brief moment, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, not triumph or satisfaction, but a deep, complicated sorrow that made her breath catch in her throat. The reception that followed was equally austere, held in the mansion's smaller dining room. Richard Reynolds stood to make a toast, his voice carrying the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he'd won. "To my daughter and her new husband," he said, raising his glass, "may this union teach you both valuable lessons about life, humility, and the importance of knowing your place in the world." Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could respond, James stood up. His movement was smooth, practiced, nothing like the careful, measured ways of a gardener. The room fell silent. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," James said, his voice carrying a new tone that made Richard's smile falter slightly. "I agree that this union will teach us all some valuable lessons. In fact, I believe those lessons will begin sooner than you expect." Before anyone could process the meaning behind his words, the dining room doors opened. A team of people in business suits entered, led by a striking woman in her 40s who carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Reynolds," the woman announced, her voice sharp and professional, "I'm Sarah Chen from the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have some matters to discuss regarding certain irregularities in Reynolds Industries' financial records over the past decade. Richard Reynolds' face went from red to white in seconds. What is the meaning of this? This is my daughter's wedding reception. Yes, James said quietly, standing to his full height. Gone was any trace of the humble gardener. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone who belonged in this world of power and wealth. And I'm afraid I haven't been entirely honest about who I am. Elizabeth watched in stunned silence as James reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card. Sliding it across the table to her father, Richard picked it up with trembling fingers, and Elizabeth saw his face go even paler. James Mitchell, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Mitchell Financial Investigations. Formerly Mitchell Financial Group, James added, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. Before you orchestrated its hostile takeover and destruction 10 years ago, before my father took his own life because of your machinations. Elizabeth felt the room spinning. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what was happening. The gardener, her new husband, wasn't a gardener at all. And her father, you're lying, Richard sputtered, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his glass. This is absurd. I'll have you arrested for what? Sarah Chen interrupted, placing a thick folder on the table. For uncovering the truth about how you systematically destroyed Mitchell Financial Group through illegal market manipulation. For finding evidence of how you bribed officials to look the other way. Or perhaps for discovering the offshore accounts where you've been hiding the profits from these activities for the past decade. Elizabeth's mind was racing, pieces falling into place. The careful way James had always positioned himself during garden parties, close enough to overhear important conversations. The mysterious phone calls her father had been taking lately, the increasing pressure he'd put on her to marry someone, anyone, he could control. I spent 5 years planning this, James said, his voice carrying a weight of contained emotion. 5 years, working as your gardener, watching, waiting, gathering evidence. I knew you'd never suspect the man who trimmed your roses of being capable of bringing down your empire. He turned to Elizabeth, and for the first time, real regret showed in his features. I'm sorry you were caught in the middle of this. You were caught. Your father's ultimatum about our marriage was unexpected, but it provided the perfect opportunity to finally bring everything to light. Elizabeth sat in stunned silence, her mind racing through every interaction she'd had with James over the years. All those times she'd dismissed him as just the gardener. He'd been watching, learning, building a case against her father. She thought about the shell companies she'd created to buy shares in Reynolds Industries, her own attempt at protecting herself from her father's control. The shares, she said suddenly, looking at James. You knew about them because I was doing the same thing, he finished. Through different channels, but for the same purpose. Between your holdings and mine, we now control nearly 40% of Reynolds Industries. Richard Reynolds stood up so quickly, his chair crashed to the floor. You can't do this. You have no proof of... We have everything, Sarah Chen interrupted, opening the folder. Bank records, emails, witness testimonies. Mr. Mitchell has been very thorough in his investigation. Elizabeth watched as her father seemed to age years in minutes, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. She thought about all the times he'd manipulated her, controlled her, used her trust fund and her position in the company as weapons against her. But there was still one thing she didn't understand. She turned to James, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. The marriage, she said. It's legal. Really legal. Why go through with it if you were about to bring him down anyway? James met her gaze steadily. Because despite everything, I wanted to give you a chance to be part of what comes next. The company needs new leadership, honest leadership. Between your business acumen and my financial expertise, we could rebuild both Reynolds Industries and Mitchell Financial Group into something better than either of them ever was. Elizabeth felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. She looked at her father, now sitting with his head in his hands as Sarah Chen continued to read from her documents. She looked at James, the man she'd married hours ago, who now stood revealed as something entirely different from what she'd believed. She thought about all her plans, her secret accumulation of shares, her dream of one day taking control of the company on her own terms. "You could have told me," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Would you have believed me?" James asked quietly. "Would you have trusted anything I said while you saw me as nothing more than your father's gardener?" The truth of his words stung, but Elizabeth recognized their wisdom. She'd been so caught up in her own prejudices, her own assumptions about status and worth, that she'd never looked beyond the surface, just as her father had never suspected that the man trimming his hedges was actually orchestrating his downfall. Sarah Chen was now speaking with Richard's lawyer, who looked increasingly distressed. Other members of her team were collecting documents, taking photographs of records, and conducting interviews with the shocked wedding guests. Elizabeth stood up, smoothing down her simple white dress. "I need time to think," she said, looking between James and her father. "This is a lot to process." James nodded. "I understand, but there's something else you should know." He reached into his jacket again and withdrew another envelope. "This isn't just about revenge for what happened to my father. I've uncovered evidence that your father's current business practices are putting thousands of jobs at risk. If we don't act now, a lot of innocent people will suffer." Elizabeth took the envelope with steady hands, her business mind already beginning to work, despite the emotional chaos of the day. "I'll look this over tonight," she said. "And tomorrow? Tomorrow we'll talk about the future." As she walked out of the dining room, head held high despite the whispers and stares, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of possibility. Yes, her world had just been turned upside down. Yes, the man she'd married was not who she'd thought he was. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she might have a real partner in building something meaningful, something honest. Behind her, she heard her father's broken voice, "Elizabeth, please." But she didn't turn around. She had a lot to think about, a lot to process, and tomorrow would bring decisions that would affect not just her life, but the lives of thousands of others. James watched her go, knowing that the next 24 hours would determine whether his years of planning would end in triumph or tragedy. He hadn't expected to admire Elizabeth's strength, hadn't planned on respecting her business acumen, or being intrigued by her own subtle rebellion against her father's control. Now, he found himself hoping that out of this web of deception and revenge, something true might emerge. The wedding cake sat untouched on a side table, a testament to promises made and secrets revealed. Outside, the gardens James had tended so carefully continued to bloom, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the mansion's walls. Elizabeth spent the night in her childhood bedroom, poring over the documents James had given her. Spreadsheets, emails, bank statements, and witness testimonies painted a picture that made her stomach churn. Not only had her father destroyed James's family company, but he was currently involved in a scheme that would devastate several smaller companies and their employees, all to inflate Reynolds Industries' stock price before a major merger. As dawn broke over the estate gardens, Elizabeth watched from her window as James, still dressed in his expensive wedding suit, walked among the roses he'd tended for 5 years. Even from a distance, she could see the difference in his bearing now. No more stooped shoulders or careful measured movements. He carried himself like the financial expert he truly was. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Reynolds." It was Henderson, the family butler. "Mr. Mitchell requests your presence in the study when you're ready. He says there are some urgent matters that require your attention." Elizabeth changed into a business suit, armor for the battle ahead. When she entered the study, she found James sitting at her father's desk, his laptop open and several phones lined up before him. The garden dirt under his fingernails was gone, replaced by the subtle gleam of a platinum wedding band. "Your father was arrested last night," he said without preamble. The SEC has frozen most of the company's accounts, and the board is calling an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Elizabeth sat down across from him, placing the envelope of documents between them. I spent all night reading these. If even half of what's in here is true— It's all true, James interrupted softly. And there's more. Your father's recent activities have put Reynolds Industries in a precarious position. Without immediate intervention, the company could collapse within weeks, taking thousands of jobs with it, Elizabeth finished. She leaned forward, her business mind fully engaged. But between your shares and mine, we have enough voting power to prevent that, if we act quickly. James studied her face carefully. You're taking this remarkably well. I'm compartmentalizing, Elizabeth replied with a hint of her old sharpness. I'll deal with the emotional fallout of my father's crimes and my sham marriage later. Right now, there are people whose livelihoods depend on us keeping this company afloat. A ghost of a smile crossed James's face. The marriage doesn't have to be a sham, he said quietly. We could make it something real, a partnership at least. Elizabeth felt her breath catch, but before she could respond, one of the phones on the desk began to ring. James answered it on speaker. Mitchell here. James, it's Sarah Chen. The board members are already making moves. Thompson and Parker are trying to call an emergency vote to liquidate major assets before the markets open. They're working with some of your father's old contacts. Elizabeth's mind raced. Thompson and Parker had been her father's closest allies on the board. If they were pushing for liquidation, they're trying to hide the money trail, she realized aloud. If they can sell off enough assets quickly, they can bury the evidence of their involvement in your father's schemes, James finished. We need to stop them. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and rapid-fire decisions. Elizabeth was surprised at how naturally she and James worked together. His deep understanding of financial investigations complemented her knowledge of corporate operations perfectly. By the time they arrived at Reynolds Industries headquarters for the board meeting, they had a plan. The lobby fell silent as they walked in together, Elizabeth in her power suit and James in what she now recognized as a perfectly tailored Tom Ford. The whispers followed them to the elevator. Ready? James asked as they approached the boardroom. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. I was born ready. They entered to find the boardroom in chaos. Thompson was red-faced, shouting into his phone, while Parker was huddled with a group of lawyers in the corner. The other board members sat in various states of shock or anger. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth announced, her voice cutting through the noise. This emergency meeting will come to order. You have no authority here, Thompson sputtered. With your father's arrest— Actually, James interrupted smoothly, between my shares and Elizabeth's, we control nearly 40% of the company. And— He paused as Sarah Chen entered the room with another stack of documents. We have evidence that you and Mr. Parker were fully aware of Richard Reynolds' illegal activities. The color drained from Thompson's face. Parker's lawyers suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Over the next 2 hours, Elizabeth and James laid out their plan to save the company. They would implement immediate transparency measures, cooperate fully with the SEC investigation, and restructure the board to remove any members implicated in Richard's schemes. Most importantly, they would protect the jobs of thousands of employees who had nothing to do with their superiors' crimes. This company has a chance to become something better, Elizabeth told the shell-shocked board members. Something built on integrity rather than deception. Those of you who want to be part of that future are welcome to stay. Those who don't— She let the implications hang in the air. One by one, Thompson, Parker, and their allies left the room, their lawyers trailing behind them. By the end of the day, Elizabeth and James had secured enough support from the remaining board members to begin implementing their plans. As they left the building that evening, exhausted but victorious, Elizabeth felt James's hand brush against hers. She didn't pull away. We make a good team, he said softly. We do, she agreed. But there's still so much we need to talk about, so much I need to understand. They ended up in a small Italian restaurant far from the corporate district, both still in their business attire, but somehow more relaxed. Over pasta and wine, James finally told her everything. "My father built Mitchell Financial Group from nothing," he explained, twirling spaghetti around his fork. "He was brilliant, ethical, and completely unprepared for someone like your father. When Richard Reynolds began his takeover attempt, my father believed he could fight it legally, honorably. He didn't understand that your father had already bribed regulators, manipulated stock prices, and corrupted key employees." Elizabeth listened, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. "And after my father's suicide, I disappeared myself, changed my identity, erased my history. I knew the only way to expose your father was to get close to him, to make him believe I was harmless." James's eyes met hers across the table. "I never expected you to be caught in the middle. I never expected to—" "To what?" Elizabeth prompted when he fell silent. "To admire you," he finished. "To respect your intelligence, your strength. To watch you quietly fighting against your father's control in your own way. When he forced this marriage, I thought it was perfect for my plans. I never imagined it might become something I actually wanted to be real." Elizabeth took a long sip of her wine, considering his words. "You know, all those years I looked down on you as just the gardener. I was doing exactly what my father did to your family, judging worth by status and appearance. I was wrong. We were both wrong. We can't change the past," James said gently, "but we can build something better for the future, not just with the company, but with us. If you want to." Elizabeth studied him thoughtfully. The anger and humiliation she'd felt at being forced to marry the gardener had transformed into something else. Respect for the man who had sacrificed years of his life to expose the truth. Admiration for his patience and determination, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. "One condition," she said finally. "No more secrets, no more hidden agendas. If we're going to do this, run the company together, build a real marriage, we do it with complete honesty." James reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His fingers were still slightly calloused from years of gardening work, a reminder of his dedication to uncovering the truth. "Complete honesty," he agreed. "Starting now." As they left the restaurant, walking close but not quite touching, Elizabeth looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city lights. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "the gardens at the estate, did you actually know what you were doing with them, or was that part of the act too?" James laughed, a real, genuine sound she'd never heard from him before. "That was real. I learned gardening from my mother. It kept me sane during those 5 years, creating beauty while working to expose ugly truths." Elizabeth smiled. "Then maybe we should keep the gardens, as a reminder of where we started and how far we've come." "I'd like that," James said softly, "though I might hire an actual gardener this time. I have a company to help run now, after all." As they drove back to the estate, no longer as the gardener and the heiress, but as partners in every sense, Elizabeth realized that sometimes the most beautiful things could grow from the most unexpected circumstances. Like roses blooming in carefully tended soil, their relationship had the potential to become something neither of them had imagined possible, but there were still challenges ahead. The company needed stabilizing, the investigation was ongoing, and her father's trial would bring more revelations and pain. Yet for the first time, Elizabeth felt truly confident about the future. She had a partner she could trust, a purpose that went beyond profit, and a chance to rebuild something meaningful from the ashes of the past. 6 months after the dramatic wedding day revelations, Elizabeth stood at her office window in Reynolds Industries headquarters, now renamed Reynolds Mitchell Global. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the city as she reviewed the latest quarterly reports. The company hadn't just survived, it was thriving under its new leadership. The sound of the door opening made her turn. James entered, his suit as impeccable as always, though she could see traces of soil on his hands. He still spent Sunday mornings in their garden, claiming it helped him think clearly. "The verdict's in," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. Elizabeth took a deep breath. After months of trials and testimonies, her father's fate had finally been decided. "And 15 years, James replied, moving to stand beside her, with no possibility of early release. The judge was particularly harsh given the number of lives affected by his schemes. Elizabeth nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Richard Reynolds had pleaded guilty to multiple charges of fraud, market manipulation, and conspiracy. His confession had helped bring down several other corrupt executives and officials, though Elizabeth suspected he'd only cooperated to try to win her forgiveness. "He asked to see you," James added gently, "but only if you want to." Elizabeth turned to face her husband, a title that no longer felt strange or forced. "Do you think I should?" James's hand found hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "I think that's entirely your decision, but whatever you choose, I'm here." The past 6 months had transformed their relationship from a business arrangement into something genuine and deep. Working together to save the company, they'd discovered a shared vision for ethical business practices and corporate responsibility. The forced marriage had evolved into a true partnership, built on mutual respect, understanding, and eventually love. "I'll think about it," Elizabeth said. "Right now, we have other priorities. The Mitchell Financial Group restoration project launches next week." James smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. Using funds recovered from Richard's hidden accounts, they had begun rebuilding the company his father had lost. But instead of competing with Reynolds Mitchell Global, the new Mitchell Financial Group would focus on supporting small businesses and entrepreneurs. "The first round of grants goes out to 30 small business owners," James confirmed, "including several who were almost destroyed by your father's last scheme." Elizabeth moved to her desk, picking up a framed photograph. It showed James's father outside the original Mitchell Financial Group building, his face beaming with pride. James had kept it hidden for years, but now it held a place of honor in both their offices. "He would be proud of you," Elizabeth said softly. "Not just for exposing the truth, but for turning it into something positive." James was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the familiar scar on his palm, a reminder of the day he decided to become a gardener and begin his quest for justice. "He would have liked you," he said finally. "You have his same belief that business should be about more than just profit." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah Chen entered carrying a thick folder. After helping expose Richard Reynolds' crimes, she'd accepted a position as head of their new corporate ethics division. "The audit reports are ready for the board meeting," she announced, "and the press is already gathering downstairs for the announcement." Elizabeth straightened her jacket, professional mode engaging. "Are we ready for this?" James nodded. "The market might be nervous about our new direction at first, but the numbers support us. Ethical business practices aren't just morally right, they're profitable in the long run." Together, they headed to the boardroom. The same room where 6 months ago they'd fought to save the company was now filled with new faces, board members chosen for their integrity and vision rather than their connections. As Elizabeth began the presentation, outlining their plans for corporate restructuring and ethical investment, she caught James watching her with that look she'd come to cherish, equal parts admiration and love. Their journey from forced marriage to true partnership hadn't been easy, but it had transformed them both. Later that evening, they walked through their garden, no longer just the site of James's long deception, but a place of peace and new beginnings. The roses he'd tended so carefully during his years as a gardener were blooming again, their fragrance filling the air. "Sometimes I wonder," Elizabeth mused, "if we would have found each other without all the deception and drama, if we could have built this in a simpler way." James pulled her close, his embrace familiar and comforting. "Maybe not. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from complicated beginnings. Like these roses, they need both sunshine and rain, and careful pruning and freedom to grow wild." Elizabeth laughed. "Still the gardener at heart, aren't you?" "Always," he admitted with a smile. It taught me patience, the importance of nurturing growth, and that sometimes the most precious things take time to bloom. As the sun set over their garden, Elizabeth thought about how far they'd come. From a forced marriage built on revenge and deception, they'd created something real and lasting. The company was thriving, dedicated to ethical practices and positive change. The Mitchell Financial Group was rising again, this time as a force for good in the business world. Most importantly, they'd found in each other not just partners in business, but true companions in life. The gardener's secret had led not to destruction, but to renewal. Of a company, of a family legacy, and of two hearts that had found their way to love through the most unexpected path. "What's next for us?" Elizabeth asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. James smiled, touching the small bump just beginning to show beneath her jacket, their secret of joy they'd discovered just weeks ago. "We grow," he said simply. "We nurture. We build something beautiful." And in the garden where their story began, surrounded by the roses that had witnessed their journey from deception to truth, from forced marriage to real love, Elizabeth and James sealed their shared future with a kiss. The past, with all its pain and secrets, had bloomed into something neither of them could have imagined. A love story written in soil and boardrooms, in revenge transformed to redemption, in two hearts finding their way home. What would you have done in Elizabeth's place? Would you have forgiven James for his deception once you understood his motives? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think? Did Richard Reynolds deserve a harsher sentence for destroying so many lives? Or was justice served? Let us know what you think. How would you feel if your arranged marriage turned out to be part of an elaborate plan for justice? Was James right to include Elizabeth in his revenge, or should he have found another way? Join the discussion below. I have some questions for you. Do you think true love can grow from difficult beginnings like this? Did Elizabeth make the right choice by partnering with James to save the company? What would you have done if you discovered your father had destroyed someone's family like Richard did? If you enjoyed this story of love, revenge, and redemption in the corporate world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Click the bell icon to get notified when we release our next video. You won't want to miss our upcoming story about a mysterious inheritance that changes everything for a struggling single mother. The video showing on your screen now tells another gripping tale of unexpected love and family secrets. Click to watch it next. Remember to like and share this video if you enjoyed this story of how a simple gardener's secret changed the fate of two families forever.